Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. We're moving on to our penultimate unit in this course on the topic of personal identity. We warmed up to it a little bit previously by discussing self-knowledge, self-examination, but that discussion presupposes that we have a concept of what it is to be a self, what part of ourselves we think is worth examining, that, for example, examining yourself in the sense that's relevant to philosophy, many people assume is not so much a matter of examining your body, but rather examining aspects of your mind, including the cognitive, affective, and experiential components. But one might ask, to what extent do those three components or dimensions hang together into a notion of a coherent self? That is a question that's raised in the topic of personal identity. Now, when we talk about personal identity, we are thinking about what it is to be a person over time, the same person over a period of time, as well as what it is to be a person at a single moment of time. I'll come back and expand on that distinction in just a moment, but first let me introduce you to someone that we've mentioned before but have not discussed very much, John Locke. His dates were 1632 to 1704. He was the first modern empiricist. He was the source of the idea of a tabula rasa, the metaphor suggesting that our minds at birth are empty slates or blank slates, and that experience writes on them, and that is the way that we gain information, according to Locke's version of empiricism. Locke was friends with Isaac Newton, and Locke was also influenced by Descartes, but wanted to disagree with him on a number of fundamental points. And John Locke also wrote political theories, developed political theories that were immensely influential, including on American founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and many others. So these fathers of American democracy were busy reading John Locke when they were in college, and thereafter were very influenced by his understanding about the proper organization of a state. Now, for Locke, the significance of personhood is very wide and very profound. And if he were with us today, I suspect he would say, understanding what it is to be a person at a time, as well as to be the same person over time, is going to help give us insight into questions concerning such contested topics as abortion, artificial intelligence, animal rights, euthanasia, and moral responsibility for acts that we might have performed either a long time ago or in potentially altered states of mind due to drugs, due to psychiatric disorders, etc. What counts as being the same person is going to, how we theorize about what it is to be the same person is going to have implications for important topics such as these. Now, to make that distinction between two kinds of personal identity, two aspects of personal identity, I want to use the words diachronic and synchronic. A diachronic question of identity asks what it is for an entity A at time t to be one and the same thing as entity B at time t plus 1 or t prime. So if we're just talking about identity generally as opposed to personal identity specifically, diachronic questions of identity ask, what is it for this same thing to persist over a period of time and be the same object that was there before? For example, when Descartes discusses in the second meditation the example involving the piece of wax, he assumes, and I think the reader is naturally wanted to assume with him, that it's the same wax that undergoes those changes of melting, getting hot, and so on. Even though many of its sensible properties change, it's the same thing. Locke says it's still the same wax, no one would deny it. And insofar as he's doing that, he's assuming that the piece of wax has diachronic identity. Whereas synchronic identity is a question not primarily concerned with passage of time, but rather concerns the question what it is at any given time for a thing to be an entity of a certain sort. So what is it for a hunk of matter to be, for example, a living thing? And what is it for a living thing to be a mammal? What is it for a mammal to be a human being? Are all synchronic questions that depend on not so much how the thing persists through time, but what characteristics it has to have at a moment to qualify as having a certain status. Take an example of a metaphysical question about the persistence of an object over time. A famous one concerns what's known as the ship of Theseus. Suppose that in the year 1800 there was a brand new, just built ship called the Theseus ship, or Theseus's ship. Theseus owns it, and it's brand new. It's just leaving the dock for its maiden voyage. This is the year 1800. And then in 1805, it comes back, and a couple of planks have been damaged. Maybe a little bit of rot has set in, and so those planks are replaced, goes back out to sea. Then in 1822, it comes back to dock, and a number of planks have to be replaced because more rot. This is standard in ships made of wood, and so these are replaced with new, fresh planks. Then this process continues over a period of many years, all the way, suppose, until 1900, when not a single plank from the original 1800 ship exists on the 1900 ship, so that there's no physical continuity in the sense that there's no one particle of matter on the 1900 ship that was there on the 1800 ship. Now, even though that is the case, many of us, I suspect, would hold that so long as the replacement of the planks has been relatively gradual and done over a long enough period of time, and so long as the thing still is the same artifact that it was before, that is, serves as a ship to, for example, convey cargo from one continent to another, then Theseus's ship still exists in the year 1900. So that we still have the same ship that was there before, even though the parts have changed and over time so drastically that there's not a single particle of matter in common between the 1900 ship and the 1800 ship. That's a natural thought, and a metaphysician, someone who's concerned with these metaphysical questions, might very well ask, that's all well and good, but notice that you might also wonder what would happen. Suppose somebody had preserved all the discarded planks and cleaned them up and solved their rot problems and got them into working order again and built a ship out of those discarded planks to the exact specifications as Theseus's original ship was built to. So that in the year 1900, we've got two ships that are physically exactly duplicates of each other. One is made out of all the same material that Theseus's original ship is made out of. The other one is made out of entirely new materials. Which one is now Theseus's ship, or are they both? How do we answer that question? I'm not sure that I'm ready to provide an answer to that, but that's a question that's subject to debate. But at least in the case of the original example, in which we have piecemeal replacement of planks, and we seem to have the same ship all the same that exists at the end of that 100-year process, that's an example of diachronic identity that I want you to think about as you think about diachronic identity for other things besides artifacts that are involved in sailing. Now, many philosophers will say that an artifact like a ship or a pair of shoes or a building seems to have its diachronic identity secured by its being treated as one and the same object over time, and more specifically, not just being treated as such, but by also having the same function as it had in the original instance. So that as long as the thing is still used to sail, as opposed, for example, being put in a museum, then even if there's lots of replacement of the parts, we still have the same ship as it applies to artifacts. Whereas you might ask, is there a similar theory that we could apply to identity over time for things like animals and vegetables? Well, there are answers that might be given. Locke says this: an oak growing from a plant to a great tree and then lopped, that is cut down, is still the same oak, or if not cut down, then it's at least trimmed and pruned. It's still the same oak. And a colt grown up to a horse, sometimes fat, sometimes lean, is all the while the same horse, though in both cases there may be a manifest change of parts. Maybe there's no single cell in common between the colt and the grown-up horse. So that truly, they are not either of them the same masses of matter, though they be truly one of them the same oak and the other the same horse. So Locke wants to suggest you can have the identity of an animal or a vegetable, including a tree, over time, so long as it seems to, well, he would say, partake in the same life. He'll say a living organism such as a plant or an animal with the different stages all being part of the same life, living entity, are what counts as identity of such a thing over time, even if all the parts have changed. So Locke has discussed what it is for an animal or a plant to be the same thing over time. He now turns his attention to the question, what is the difference between a person and the biological kind of entities that we are, namely human beings? He writes, "Since I think I may be confident that whoever should see a creature of his own shape or make, though it had no more reason all its life than a cat or a parrot, would call him still a man." That is to say, for Locke, if you came across someone who's got the biological characteristics of a fellow human being, then even if they don't have anything like reason or rationality, we'd still say they're a human being, even if they lack a mind. And he also writes, whoever should hear a cat or a parrot discourse, reason, and even philosophize, would call or think it nothing but a cat or a parrot, and say the one was a dull and irrational man, the other a very intelligent, rational parrot. So for Locke, it's conceivable that there be a human being, that's what he means by man, a human being, man or woman really, who lacks rationality and presumably therefore also lacks a mind. At the same time, he wants to suggest that it's perfectly possible that there be an animal like a parrot who does have rationality, who also has a mind, but that doesn't make that individual into a human being. It's still a parrot. So parrot, human being, cat, etc. are all biological categories that we're given at birth and it seems aren't able to change, and that can stay fixed even if we gain or lose rationality. Well, what is it then for a thing to be a person? Now, we've talked a little bit about synchronic and diachronic questions. Let me apply them to the case of personhood before we get Locke's answer. As you can imagine, a synchronic theory of personal identity tells you what it is for, what conditions have to be met for an entity at a given time to count as a person as opposed to just, for example, a human being or some other biological category like a parrot. Whereas a diachronic question of personal identity is going to answer the question, if you've got a, let's call it a person stage. The person stage right now speaking to the camera, producing this discussion of personal identity exists at a certain date at a certain time in October 2015. That's a person stage known as a stage of Mitch Green, the person. And there's another person stage that existed, say, in the year 1970 when I was 7 years old, existing in the Chicago area where I grew up. Now, there was a time slice of me that existed back in 1970, and there's a time slice of me that's sitting in this chair right now. The diachronic question of personal identity is, what is it for that time slice that existed in 1970 to be, so to speak, a stage of the same person as the time slice that is here in front of the camera right now? That is the diachronic question of personal identity. Now, Locke gives an answer to that, but his answer comes in a form that applies to both synchronic and diachronic questions. Let me explain. He writes, a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself the same thinking thing in different times and places is for him what it is for a thing to be a person. And I believe that what Locke is getting at is that diachronically, to be a person, it's required that you have to consider yourself as a thinking thing. That is very similar to what Descartes considers when he talks about what answers the question, what kind of thing am I, or what am I, a thing that thinks. In so doing, Locke would say that's the ability to conceive of yourself as a thinking thing. That's what it is to count as a person at a time. What about being the same person over time? Well, he writes, in this alone consists personal identity, i.e. the sameness of rational being, and he means sameness over time. And as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. So his idea is as follows. Insofar as the current person stage in front of you, in front of the camera, is able to remember back to experiences had by the person stage of 1970, and say, for example, I can remember walking with my friends, going to a soccer game in the nearby park. I can remember riding on a train. I can remember going to see Lake Michigan, for example, when I was a kid, 7 years old, in the Chicago area. Insofar as I can, as it were, extend my consciousness back by means of memory to experiences had by the 7-year-old Mitch Green, that's what it is to be one and the same person. These so-called memory links are what make me one and the same person, this current person stage, one and the same person as a previous person stage. So now developing that, we can put the criterion as follows. Where P1 and P2 are person stages, we can say the following. P2, the one that exists later, is one and the same person as P1, just in case, or if and only if, P2 either does or can remember at least one experience had by P1. So even if I'm not remembering right now an experience had by my 7-year-old former self, I still can remember experiences had by that earlier self, that earlier person stage. And Locke will say, that's what it is for me to be one and the same person, so that we can both say, there's Mitch Green, there, and if we were to watch a very, very long movie, there's Mitch Green existing in 1970, and there he is again in 2015. Now, of course, there are lots of things that I did as a kid that I don't remember now, many of which I'm glad I don't remember, but that's not by itself going to be a problem for Locke. So long as each person stage has an experience in it that I can remember back to, it won't matter. That'll be enough for me to link back, so to speak, to that earlier person stage and thereby count as being the same self. Notice also that when we talk about being the same person, I want to focus on the literal notion of that phrase rather than the more metaphorical way that we sometimes talk. For example, suppose that I have a friend who has been smoking heavily for a long time, and she finally gives up smoking by means of lots of therapy and strength of will and suffering and pain, finally breaks the habit. A year has gone by. I haven't seen her since for that entire year. Before the year started, she was a smoker. Now the year is done, she's not a smoker at all. I might say to her, you are a changed person. You're not the same person you were before you stopped smoking. Now, we can understand why I'd say that, but for our purposes, I want you to think of that as kind of a metaphorical or hyperbolic way of speaking, in the sense that I don't literally mean that Jenny, my friend, has died and someone else has come to take over her body. This is the same person that was a smoker before, strictly speaking. And notice that, for example, if smoking Jenny that existed a year ago had committed a crime, then even if the police had not been able to find the culprit for another year or two, as long as they've got the same body that did the act, even if that person's not a smoker anymore, they would still say, we found the person that did the crime. We found the person who did this bad thing, and we can prosecute accordingly. So it wouldn't be any response to that to say, no, she's not the same person she was anymore because she stopped smoking. That makes it clear, I think, that when we say you're not the same person now that you've changed a habit or redone your wardrobe or fixed your hair or something, we don't mean that literally, we tend to mean that just metaphorically. I want to talk about not just the literal sense in which we talk about being the same person or not over a period of time. So Locke is able to brush aside a number of seeming objections to his theory by saying, let's make sure we focus on literal uses of the phrase same person as before, as opposed to the more metaphorical or hyperbolic ways of doing so, firstly. And secondly, there are cases that do seem to challenge his position. One famous one is known as the brave officer paradox. Suppose that as a little boy, let's call him LB, a man, when he was a little boy, steals apples from his neighbor's yard. He can't resist the temptation. He climbs over the fence and climbs up the apple tree in his neighbor's backyard, fills up his pockets with apples, and then sneaks back home, doesn't get caught. And then he goes into the military as a young man and becomes very brave, becomes known as a very brave officer. Let's call that BO, brave officer. And let's suppose that the brave officer can remember stealing the apples as a child, so that the little boy is one and the same person as the brave officer according to Locke's memory links theory, because the brave officer either does or with some effort can remember back to the time that he stole those apples. So by Locke's criterion, he's the same person as the little boy. But now suppose that the brave officer grows to become an old general over time. So now the old general, let's call him OG, can remember bravery on the battlefield, but it's been so long and he's lost certain of his memory capacities, he cannot remember stealing apples as a little boy. So now the old general counts as the same person as the brave officer, by Locke's theory, but the old general does not count as the same person as the little boy, according to Locke's theory, because the old general neither does nor can, even if he tries, form memories or produce memories of the experience of stealing apples as a little boy. But notice that this yields a paradoxical conclusion because identity is transitive. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, of course. So that if the old general is the same person as the brave officer, and the brave officer, as we've seen before, is the same person as the little boy, it's going to follow that the old general is the same person as the little boy by transitivity of identity. But we've also seen the conclusion that according to Locke's theory, the old general is not the same person as the little boy because he neither does nor can form memory links with that little boy. So Locke's theory yields a contradiction as applied to the brave officer case. What can we do? Well, we can, I think, refine Locke's criterion so that it says not that being the same person as an earlier person stage is a matter of having memory links that you draw directly to that person stage. That might be sufficient, but it's not necessary for counting as being one and the same person. Rather, we can refine the criterion by saying, well, let P sub n be one and the same person as P1. P1 can be very long ago, many previous person stages past, just in case Pn does or can remember at least one person experience had by person stage Pn minus 1, say 5 minutes before, or a year before, or 10 years before, which does or can remember an experience had by Pn minus 2, which does or can remember an experience had by Pn minus 3, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the way back to P sub 1. So this is a little bit like, although it's not infinite, a little bit like the idea of a causal regression, so that this person stage remembers back to an experience had by a previous person stage, which remembers back to an experience had by another previous person stage, all the way back to what happened when the man was a little boy stealing apples, so that the old general counts as being the same person as the little boy, not because he can remember directly, but that he can, so to speak, remember indirectly. He remembers an experience had by a person stage who himself remembers an experience had by a person stage who himself remembers an experience had by a person stage, and so on, repeating all the way back to age 6, when, for example, when he stole those apples from the neighbor's backyard. So that if that's right, we've got a refinement of Locke's criterion in such ways to resolve the brave officer paradox. Locke thinks that his theory applies in such ways to help us make sense of otherwise puzzling phenomena. So, for example, he's going to apply his theory to examples that involve, for instance, sleepwalking. Suppose that you have a problem with sleepwalking, and one night in your sleep you get out of bed, and as a sleepwalker you do some damage. Say you go over to a nearby apartment and break some glass, maybe say some nasty things to the person that you see inside the apartment in whose window you just broke. Now, then you shuffle your way back into your own apartment and go back to sleep, or continue sleeping, as the case may be. But you never woke up, you were sleepwalking the entire time. Locke is going to say that in that case, you are actually not the same person as the one who was doing those deeds sleepwalking. He writes, imagining this is something that Socrates does, if the same Socrates waking and sleeping do not partake of the same consciousness, Socrates waking and sleeping are not the same person. And to punish Socrates waking for what sleeping Socrates thought and waking Socrates was never conscious of would no more be right than to punish one twin for what his brother twin did, whereof he knew nothing, because their outsides were so like that they could not be distinguished. So just as it would be unfair to punish me for something that my identical twin brother, my evil twin, did, that would seem wrong. I shouldn't be responsible for what my brother does, even if we look exactly alike. So too, Locke says, waking Socrates should not be held responsible for what sleeping Socrates does, even if sleeping Socrates does some damage. And Locke will say not just that, but sleeping Socrates is a different person from waking Socrates, at least perhaps for moral and legal purposes. We wouldn't blame sleeping Socrates, at least criminally, for anything that sleeping Socrates did. Let me try it again. We wouldn't blame waking Socrates for what sleeping Socrates did in a situation of the sort that I described. Now, you might have doubts about whether it's the same person. You might be more inclined to think that it is the same person, but you can see where Locke is coming from with regard to issues of moral responsibility. I suspect in American law, we probably would hold even waking Socrates legally, and more precisely, civilly responsible for any damage that sleepwalking Socrates does. But we might wonder whether or not that applies in a direct way to issues of personal identity over time. Notice also that Locke, if he were here, might say, now that we know about such phenomena as multiple personality disorder, he might say when there are genuine cases, and they are pretty rare, but the media has discussed some, you've probably heard of examples of multiple personality. If there are genuine cases of multiple personality, then Locke would say that's an example in which, so long as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for example, are such that neither one can remember experiences had by the other, then what you should really do is describe the situation as two different persons taking turns inhabiting one body. So that just because there's one human being does not mean there's one person inside. There might be multiple persons inside one human being, one human body. That seems like a possibility that Locke's theory would suggest could very well happen. And Locke would say, if you were with us today, I think, if you were to learn about multiple personality disorder, say, yep, that's precisely what my theory predicts, and it explains it. It makes sense of it. It shows us why we would feel uncomfortable blaming Dr. Jekyll for what Mr. Hyde does. Even if Mr. Hyde does terrible things, Dr. Jekyll should not be held responsible because it's a different person who just takes over. So long as we can show that it's not just Dr. Jekyll trying to get away with bad things, but rather a different person, then moral responsibility does not spill over into another person, just as we would hope that I would not be held responsible for what my twin brother does. So that's one implication of Locke's theory that we might find interesting and perhaps a bit of support for the position that he takes. Notice also that, just to put this in more general terms for a moment, you might ask, why does diachronic, specifically diachronic identity, matter? Well, it does matter because of such things as legal and moral responsibility. That is, we often do want to know whether this person stage in front of us is the same person as the person stage who, say, 10 or 15 years ago committed some heinous crimes. Even if the body in front of us is very different from the one that did those crimes, perhaps this body is very scarred or had a great deal of plastic surgery or has lost a limb or has grown into an adult. None of those quite answer the question, is it the same person? Whereas Locke's theory of diachronic identity tries to answer that question, and as such purports to give us an answer to problems concerning, well, what should we do legally, and likewise, what kind of moral blame could we mete out to the person stage in front of us right now. Likewise, mental disorders can be understood perhaps more deeply on the Lockean perspective. As I've suggested, multiple personality disorder is one example in which we can apply the theory to help us understand something that's otherwise very puzzling. Likewise, and we've discussed this already, let's go back to it again, if we think about survival after death. Without being theists, we can still at least conceive of the possibility, it seems, although Ryle is now one voice we've heard that's going to be deeply skeptical of the possibility of surviving after the death of our bodies. Nevertheless, Locke and many other philosophers, theists, and everyday folks take the possibility of continuing to exist, being the same person that was there before, in spite of the destruction of my body. They'll take that possibility very seriously, but then they'll need to give an account of how that's possible. Locke is going to say, I've got an account of how that's possible. I can tell you precisely what could happen. You could, for example, find yourself going to heaven, no longer having a body, and looking back, that is, remembering experiences that you had as an embodied terrestrial being, and saying, yes, that was me. That's myself that was doing those things back on Earth, the same self. And Locke will say, I can explain how you know that because on the basis of the fact that you can form memory links with the previous person stages that it previously had a body, even if you no longer have one. We can explain how you persisted through that radical change. Another question you might ask for Locke is the following. You can imagine, you might also have come across people who seem to remember experiences that they could not have possibly had. So imagine there's a rather nutty history professor who specializes in the early part of the 19th century, things that happened in Europe at that time, and he might have spent so much time studying, for example, Napoleon, that he seems to remember, he tells you he remembers, doing the things that Napoleon did. He says, I remember the Battle of Austerlitz and crossing the Alps on that beautiful steed. I remember my exile onto the Isle of Elba and being saved from drowning by a Newfoundland dog and so on. Now, you want to say, those aren't genuine memories. You can't really remember something that didn't happen to you. You can only seem to remember. Those are apparent memories. And Locke surely would want to say that. That is, there's a difference between seeming to remember something, even if you're vividly certain that that's something that happened to you, that would still be an illusion. Likewise, there might have been things that I did as a child that my brothers and parents have repeated enough times that I developed the illusion over time of thinking that I remember doing those things, even if I'm in fact not remembering those experiences that happened to me. In my case, it would be the same self, but not because I can form direct memory links to that earlier self, but rather because I can form, hopefully, indirect memory links to that person stage. But for the rather nutty history professor, who literally thinks he's Napoleon, doesn't just identify with him, but thinks he is Napoleon, Locke would have to say something like this: those are just quasi-memories, not genuine memories. If they were genuine, it would have to have been you that did those things. These are just quasi-memories. But then if we ask Locke, what's the difference between quasi-memories and genuine memories? We don't want an answer that's just in terms of, well, in the case of genuine memories, you can remember back to experiences, and in the case of quasi-memories, you can't, because then the question is, well, why one and not the other? What's the difference? I think Locke is going to have to say something like the following. There needs to be a continuous life, or at least causal process, that goes from the earlier person stage and the creation of memories to the later person stage. If there isn't a continuous causal process, then it's not clear how we can have memories occurring at all, as opposed to just seeming or apparent memories. So that suggests that in order to understand Locke's position, we've got to make some reference to a causal process, and that causal process would seem to have to be one that involves changes in matter, either in the form of memories formed in the central nervous system, or if you think that it's possible to have a mind in spite of not having a central nervous system, a possibility that we considered in our discussion of the philosophy of mind, you might say, no, it's not that, but rather it's something more like perhaps you have to have memories created in a set of silicone chips, but they've got to be physically realized somewhere and persist in a continuous way over time for me to count as having genuine memories and not just quasi-memories. Now, if Locke's going to say that, then notice that it'll be less easy for him and his view of personal identity over time to look like it goes hand in hand with dualism. You might think it goes hand in hand with dualism because it suggests, at least on first reading, that Locke's theory allows just ideas to make my person stages connected into one and the same person over time. But that's not so clear once we think about the difference between quasi and genuine memories. To be genuine memories, there has to be a continuous causal process. That causal process must be a physical process. And so being the same person over time seems to require some kind of physical continuity. So we've seen that Locke's theory seems to have to admit some kind of physical basis to the continuity over time of a person. In the absence of that physical basis, it's not clear what the causal process could be that would enable us to distinguish between genuine memories and quasi-memories. That's one potential objection to Locke's view. Here's another that might be more direct. Some of you might have seen one of my favorite movies called Memento. And in that movie, the main character's name is Lenny, and Lenny suffers from a brain injury known as anterior grade amnesia that makes him unable to make new memories. He's got memories of his life before the accident that caused this brain injury, but he doesn't, after the accident, he's not able to form new memories. So he starts a conversation with somebody, looks away, and then looks back at the person and says, "Where'd you come from? How'd you get here?" Having no memory of the fact the person had been there up until 10 seconds ago. But he can remember things from before his injury, although he cannot form new memories even after 30 seconds have gone by after the experience that he just had. So what do we want to say about a situation like that? That seems to put pressure perhaps even on Locke's refined definition of personal identity. So notice that Lenny can remember experiences had by let's call him Lenny before the accident, let's just call him Lenny before. And let's call him Lenny N can remember experiences had by Lenny before. And Lenny N minus 1 can remember experiences had by Lenny before the accident as well. But Lenny N neither does nor can remember experiences had by Lenny N minus 1. So, and there's no shorter series of links that can connect Lenny N and Lenny N minus 1 following Locke's refined criterion. So it seems like Lenny N and Lenny before are the same person, and Lenny N minus 1 and Lenny before are the same person from what we said before. But we also seem to have the conclusion that Lenny N and Lenny N minus 1 are not the same person. What follows? Well, since identity is transitive, we can also infer that Lenny N is the same person as Lenny N minus 1, so we get yet another contradiction. Here's a diagram. Lenny at, for example, 11 o'clock one morning after the accident can remember experiences had by pre-accident Lenny and Lenny before. Lenny at noon, an hour after Lenny at 11, can also remember experiences had by pre-accident Lenny. But Lenny N at noon can't remember experiences had by Lenny at 11, nor can he remember experiences had by a previous Lenny, which can trace back to an experience had by a Lenny previous to it, et cetera, all the way back to Lenny at 11. They're totally disjoint person stages. So that if that's right, Lenny at noon seems to nevertheless be the same person as pre-accident Lenny. And as we said, Lenny at 11 is the same person as pre-accident Lenny, but Lenny at noon seems to bear no direct or indirect connection or links to Lenny at 11, and so Lenny at 11 seems to be distinct from Lenny at noon, and yet by transitivity we also have that Lenny at 11 is the same person as Lenny at noon. So again, we get what seems to be a contradiction. Something seems to have to give in Locke's theory. It seems clear that it's the same Lenny all through the story, and if that's right, then Locke's theory, which seems to imply otherwise, seems to be in trouble. Perhaps this idea of memory links, even in the refined sense we've suggested, is not necessary for personal identity over time, even if it is sufficient. And likewise, think about how Lenny's different from a case of multiple personality disorder. We have, in the case of multiple personality disorder, we have multiple people inhabiting one body. In the case of Lenny, what do we have? Could we have one body and perhaps multiple people at different moments? That doesn't seem very plausible. It seems like it's the same guy, he just can't remember anything that happened to him a moment ago. Now, philosophers that were more or less contemporary with Locke, or came a little bit thereafter, like Thomas Reid, thought that Locke was onto something reasonable but didn't get things quite right. He thought that the memory links theory was useful as an indication of identity, but not as a definition of identity. He writes, "Although memory gives the most irresistible evidence of my being the identical person that did such a thing in the past, at such and such a time, I may have other good evidence of things which befell me and which I do not remember. For example, I know who bare me, that is, who gave birth to me, and I know who suckled me, that is, who I nursed, what person nursed me. But I do not remember these events, even though," Reid will say, "I'm the same person." So Reid concludes from this that, in writing, "It's not my remembrance of an action of mine that makes me the same person who did it. That's not what makes me the same person. It's an indication of it, but it's not what makes me the same person. This remembrance makes me know assuredly that I did it, but I might have done it, though I don't remember it at all. That relation to me, which is expressed by saying that I did it, would be the same, though I had not the least remembrance of it." So Reid wants to reject Locke's theory of personal identity as a definition of personal identity in terms of memory links, and just say memory links are indications or evidence of sameness of person over time, but they're not what makes me the same person over time. To which you might ask, well, Reid, what's your theory of personal identity over time? His reply essentially is to deny that it's possible to give a helpful answer to that question. He writes, "If you ask a definition of identity, I confess I can give none. It's too simple a notion to admit of a logical definition." That is, he takes the idea of identity over time as fundamental and indefinable. He thinks that there is such a thing as identity over time. He thinks that it does happen. That is, I am the same person as was sitting here 10 minutes ago, for example, but he doesn't think that it's a notion that can be defined and therefore that we can get any philosophical insight into. So he essentially throws in the towel. Likewise, David Hume, who we discussed before, for example, under the rubric of Hume's principle, also discussed Locke's theory of personal identity, and he suggests the following. He thinks that the idea of personal identity over time is, in fact, in a way, illusory. Unlike Reid, who thinks it's a genuine thing, Hume is skeptical that there's a genuine notion of personal identity over time that we could possibly believe to be accurate. He writes, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything without the perception itself as well." So his idea seems to be, when I try to look inside and find myself, all I find are particular emotions and experiences and thoughts, images, etc., never a self. And he concludes from this that, in a sense, the idea of personal identity is perhaps a mythology. That is, the foregoing remark from Hume and his general empiricist tendencies suggest that there's no reason to believe in this notion of diachronic personal identity. Hume seems to hold that the idea of diachronic personal identity is perhaps a sort of fiction that we spin for convenience. Maybe it's just a matter of convenience that we discuss sameness of person over time, as opposed to that notion capturing an objective phenomenon. He writes, as support for this reading, identity is nothing really belonging to these different perceptions and uniting them together, but is merely a quality which we attribute to them because of the union of their ideas in the imagination when we reflect upon them. That is, remember from Hume's principle, Hume said a collection, for example, a nation or a city, is nothing over and above all the individuals making it up and their way of interacting with each other. There's the drawing a boundary around a certain geographical region is really a matter of a mental construction rather than something that is there objectively in itself. Likewise here too, Hume will say, being a person is something that we just write on to individuals, so to speak. We ascribe it to individuals rather than discover it. It's a fiction that we create for our own convenience, not something that refers to something objectively real. But this is something we might ask about. Can we be content with this? When we're deciding whether to, for example, punish this person for what this person stage, for what some other earlier person stage did, we don't seem to presuppose that diachronic personal identity is in the eye of the beholder or a matter of convenience. We want to know whether this is the person that, for example, shot somebody in cold blood last year at a gas station. We want to know whether this is the person that stole money out of that bank and killed a number of other individuals in the process. We want to know whether this is the person that hacked into the computer program and did lots of damage, such as was found out about some months ago. It doesn't seem like that's a matter of conventional stipulation, but rather of discovery. And if that's right, then perhaps we can't rest content with Hume's skepticism about personhood.